What's new on the shelf with Phoenix? Well, Writing as a Way of Healing by Luis DeSalvo. Now, writing to me has always been about open-endedness. So, for instance, you have some ideas in your mind and they feel very open-ended. So you sit down at your computer and look at your blank page and you realize that you can write whatever you want. Now, while there are creative and expressive ways of writing that fall outside of just the idea of open-endedness. So there's a way in which people write for all sorts of reasons that don't have to do with the possibilities of imagination, but more with specific end games in mind and goals. I would say that the thing that has always encouraged me about writing is that writing is open-ended. So I decide what I'm going to do. I decide what I'm going to say. I decide the approach in which I take the book. And such things are what give me a lot of motivation. One thing that I think dovetails with this idea of writing as open-endedness is actually some of what DeSalvo talks about in Writing as a Way of Healing. So in my mind, there is a lot that can be gleaned from using writing in any way you please, but also using it as a way to heal. Now, one thing that I think is interesting about DeSalvo's book is the research that she does to be able to come up with her conclusions that writing can actually help you heal from trauma. And so I think it's really helpful to dive right into it. And I would say that there are two ways, according to DeSalvo, that can help you heal with writing. The first is that when you're writing, you don't just vent. You don't just rant about emotions. What you do instead is you write in a way that is true to your emotions. You write about what you feel. You write about what your emotions are. And you really delve into what those emotions express and what they feel like and what they're like. The other piece that DeSalvo talks about is that you write descriptively. So you take an event, most likely a traumatic event, and you write about it in a descriptive way. And you do this in order to help you process the traumatic emotions and memories that you have experienced in life, which then helps you process it. And what's interesting is that there are researchers like Pennebaker, which DeSalvo talks about, who are people who have done research on the fact that writing can be a way of healing. Now, I want to emphasize that that is the technique, which is you focus on the emotions that you feel and have felt in those encounters. You also link that with a descriptive account. I wanted to convey that idea because I wanted to share that if you are using writing as a way of healing, which I am as well, because I decided that one of the ways that I would be able to improve as a writer and to improve my life and my psychological and physical well-being was actually by writing in a way that I found cathartic or meaningful or purposeful. And that was what I wanted to do. I want writing to be a way of healing. You could use the word catharsis, which is Aristotelian. You could use a variety of different descriptive words to describe that healing process. But really, healing is a big piece of it because you are allowing yourself to overcome difficult things and you're using writing as a way of doing that. And I think keeping writing open-ended is definitely a way to do that. Now, there's a lot to unpack about DeSalvo's book. She definitely references a lot of writers from Virginia Woolf and Henry Miller to Isabel Allende. And she talks about these writers who used their words and their books and their narratives and stories as a way of healing. And it's really interesting reading this book because there's a lot of examples of ways in which people have used writing to uncover the traumas and to process the traumas that they've experienced. And I think that that was incredibly helpful. Now, there's a lot that you could unpack about DeSalvo's book, and there's a lot that I find useful about the book, but I want to pause and kind of analyze my own approach when I think of being a writer's writer, or I think of being a writer myself, and looking at it in terms of what I gain from writing itself and why I find it to be healing. I think one of the most amazing aspects of writing is that it is expressive. You're using language which doesn't necessarily come easily, but comes in a way that feels instinctual. And I think whenever we're able to write in a way that is natural to our inclinations and natural to our thought processes, I think that it helps us be able to convey and express ourselves. I think there's a way in which we actually take for granted about the fact that writing and art are ways of healing. And I think we do this because we often tend to see art as needing to be very refined and technical, as well as super literary and specific and detailed. And while those things are great, and they're great qualities to have in any book, we also forget that writing is messy, that art is messy, that life is messy. And so, if we can find a way of structuring our narrative to understand our traumatic experiences, I think that's incredibly helpful, and that's a lot of what DeSalvo talks about, and what Pennebaker has found in his research, and what I think many writers throughout the ages have found so beautiful about writing. And so for me personally, I know that my writing is sometimes semi-autobiographical. I'm writing about something, whether autobiographically or in terms of autofiction, where there's a lot more liberties and creative liberties at that. But I use these platforms as a way of engaging with my own psyche and engaging with my past. And I find that semi-autobiographical approach to be really helpful because you're able to really think about what you've experienced in life. And you're able to process those things. And I think that that can be amazingly helpful to be able to do. But I also don't think writing necessarily has to be autobiographical just to be expressive or healing. And even though DeSalvo does focus a lot on the art of the written word as being useful for overcoming trauma, whenever you use this formulation that she's described here, of writing descriptively and writing about the emotions of events, I think it's super interesting because I think, going back to my original point, that writing is indeed open-ended. And I love this idea. I love the idea of being able to write in a way that is expressive and true and is literary, but also beautiful and artistic, and that captures these experiences that people have. And I think that if I was going to encourage a young writer, or I was going to encourage someone who was struggling with writing, for whatever reason, I would encourage them to pick up the pen to realize that they can use the pen, they can use the keyboard, they can use their notebooks as a way of becoming whole. And I think this is an incredibly healing idea to have in life, that it's not just the articulation of your experiences, as important as that is, but it's also the articulation of your whole self, of the various parts of yourself that maybe you have trouble conveying, but that you're able to do in writing. And I'd encourage you to do this because I think writing is really an encouraging force. I think it's an encouraging medium because the language is yours. You know, people can joke about people that misspell words and have typos in their manuscripts and in their published books. But an interesting idea is that it is your language. And so while you do want to avoid what you could call mistakes, because you want it to be grammatical, there's still a way in which what I think is so powerful about writing is they are still your words. So what if you use an expression that is not so grammatically correct, but captures what you're feeling? So what if you spell a word multiple ways because that's the way that it makes sense to you in your mind? I see writing as needing to be very intuitive. And that's what I think DeSalvo and many other authors have found with writing, is that it is intuitive. It's an intuitive medium that allows you to use the language and narrative that you want to use, that allows you to use the words that you want to use in the ways that make the most sense. And I think that can be incredibly helpful. I think it can be incredibly useful, and I think that it can be incredibly healing. And so for me, I'll be honest, I have found a lot of healing from all of the writing I've done throughout the years. It's not as if writing itself is necessarily a panacea in the way that people might argue that philosophy and various forms of art are not necessarily a panacea, but I do think there's a way in which it can still help you overcome things and find healing in a way that helps you deal with the world in a way that will help you get through. And I think what can be helpful to be aware of is that you get to decide what you convey. And so while I would indeed encourage you to try to write in this style that DeSalvo is talking about, to use these techniques, and while I'm using them myself in my own writing, I would also encourage you to try to look at them in terms of the open-endedness of the words that you have to use, of the stories that you want to tell. And I think that that's going to be a way that you're going to be able to express your true self and be able to express what's most important to you in your writing and be able to convey what matters. And I think that writing is healing just through the very action of doing it. Even as, of course, there's also a lot of research that writing in very specific ways can be useful as well. So yeah, I hope that you'll check out this book. I hope that you'll write. I hope that you'll think really hard about the craft. I hope that you'll use the words that make sense. And yeah, I have found an amazing amount of healing by writing my books and by writing the things that I've written. So yeah, I'm Phoenix. Thank you for watching. Thank you for watching this series in The Writer's Writer. And yeah, I will see you soon.